The legendary jazz drummer Buddy Rich once said,
"I don't think any arranger should ever write a drum part for a drummer. Because if a drummer can't create his own interpretation of the chart and he plays everything that's written, he becomes mechanical. He has no freedom."
And to an extent, he's right. Drums are one of the most formulaic instruments. Most popular genres have a couple signature patterns, so if you've got a good drummer, you can just tell them the style and let them fill in the details. Micromanaging a drum part sucks the life out of it. But on the other hand, that formulaic nature makes the drums a little too easy to take for granted. If you're not careful, all your drum parts will wind up sounding basically the same. And that's especially true these days. A lot of modern styles use drum machines and sequencers, not live drummers, so even if they aren't your main thing, if you want to make music, you still need to know how to think about drums. And that's what this video is. I'm a vocalist by training, but I'm also a composer. Over the years, I've had to learn a lot about how drums work within a song, so I thought I'd put together a music theorist's guide on how these parts come together, how to keep them interesting, and some of the stuff I look for when I'm analyzing them. If you're a drummer, you probably know a lot of this already, but if you're not, listen up. This video is sponsored by Nebula. Get 40% off an annual plan with a link in the description. Let's start by examining our toolbox. A standard trap set drum kit has around 6 to 10 different components, and there are dozens, if not hundreds, of other common percussion sounds available. So to keep this list from spiraling out of control, I'm going to break them up into 3 main families. First is the low drums. By far the most common of these is the kick drum, but this also includes floor toms, stomps, and synthetic sounds like the 808 kick. Above those are the medium drums, typically the snare, but also claps, snaps, shakers, woodblocks, and congas, and then the high drums, which are mostly various kinds of cymbals, including hi-hats and tambourines. Each family occupies a different part of the acoustic space, and since most drum parts are played mainly with 1 foot and 2 hands, they tend to consist primarily of one sound from each group. In rock, that's usually kick, snare, hi-hat, but you can swap those out for any other drum from the same family and get a pretty similar result. Not identical, and we'll talk about that later, but for now, it's close enough. This may seem like a gross oversimplification, and yeah, it kind of is, but it's also really useful. It lets us take a complete drum part and break it up into 3 separate parts that we can work with individually. Those parts exist in conversation with each other, and each one is typically doing a different job. These days, the way I think about drum functions is mostly based on a framework described by 8-bit music theory in his video about writing drums, which I'll link in the description if you want to learn more. I'm not going to dwell on this too much because 8-bit already did, but to quickly summarize, he breaks a drum pattern up into 3 functions. The beat, which defines the pulse of the song, the engine, which creates momentum by contradicting that pulse, and the constant, which fills the rest of the space. And this way of dividing the drums into 3 parts usually matches our previous one. In many styles, the beat is typically low drums, the engine is medium, and the constant is high. That's not always true. In Bleed, for instance, the double bass kick becomes more of a constant, leaving the beat layer to be filled by slower cymbals. And in 50 Ways to Leave Your Lover, the snare is constant, while the tambourine plays the upbeats like an engine. Like with everything then, this isn't a hard rule you have to follow. I'm not going to tell you what job each part should do. My advice here is just to think about each of the 3 registers and ask which function you want that line to perform. But that's not really what this video is about. Writing one drum beat isn't that hard. I mean, it can be if you want to do something really intricate, but thousands of hit songs have been built on a pretty basic rock beat. If you're not a drummer, you probably don't need your drum parts to be that complicated. That's a mistake I used to make a lot, but really, you just need them to work. Which brings me to what I believe is the most underrated aspect of drum writing: development. It's easy to just write one beat and use it for the whole song, but unless you're really careful, that gets boring quickly. Like, I just used Back in Black as an example of an extremely straightforward drum part, but even there, the verse drums aren't quite the same as the chorus drums. The latter has more frequent cymbal accents and uses a more open hi-hat, creating a subtle sense of progression, and that sort of thing makes a huge difference. But for many composers, the way we're taught to think about musical development is extremely centered around harmony and melody. I can't speak for anyone else, but the general impression I got back in college was that if you wanted to write a new section, the first thing to do was work out a new chord progression with some new melodic contours and phrasing. Those were the tools I learned to use, and that's honestly kind of enough for most instruments. The orchestration changes you have to make flow pretty naturally from those initial steps. But the drums don't play the harmony or the melody. That's not their domain, so when you're changing up the guitar, bass, keys, vocals, whatever to fit with a new musical landscape, it can be easy to forget that the drums should change too. But without pitches, what is there for the drums to change? A lot. The most obvious is just physical dynamics. You can make a section seem bigger by hitting the drums harder. But while that does work in theory, I couldn't actually find a good example of it because very few songs rely exclusively on this approach. There's usually something more going on, which brings me to some recent work by Dr. David Geary, who describes 3 main kinds of changes you can make to a drum part to really highlight the different sections. If you want a subtle change, you can just do one of these, but you can also mix and match from different categories to create more drastic section boundaries. Up to you. And the nice thing about these is that if you are working with a drummer, they're the sort of thing you can usefully communicate without trying to micromanage every individual attack. Thinking at this level lets you be precise enough to define the skeleton of what you want while leaving the details up to an actual professional. That, by the way, is, in my opinion, the key to good arranging, especially in small ensembles. Your job is to have the overall vision and to make sure everyone's working together toward that goal. Trust your bandmates to handle the rest. That's what they're there for. That's not really a drum-specific tip, but still something to keep in mind. Anyway, the first thing to consider changing is the number of layers. Like, sure, you can have low, medium, and high drums, but you don't have to have all of them all the time. You could start with just cymbals, every time that I look in the mirror, to leave space for a more dramatic chorus, or you could leave the middle layer empty, so it can be filled in later. You can even start with no drums at all, I'm so tired of being here, and save them up for a big entrance at a particularly dramatic point. In total, there's 8 possible combinations here. No drums, all drums, each of the 3 layers on its own, and each pair of layers. Adding new layers means the drums start encroaching on a new portion of the audio space, making the section feel more intense and dramatic, while removing layers leaves a gap that feels empty and calm. In theory, you could even jump around to different kinds of layers without changing the number, like just low in the verse and just high in the pre-chorus, but I don't know of any songs that actually do that. Still, it's an option. But the various drum layers aren't all created equally. The reason we split them up like this in the first place is that each one has its own character. I don't want to be too prescriptive here, because these sounds are really flexible in terms of what they can represent. There's no one musical image attached to each one, but as a general guideline, I think low drums provide weight, medium drums provide energy, and high drums provide atmosphere. Sort of. Again, not an exact science, but when I'm trying to decide which layer will do the best job capturing the vibe I'm going for, I like to think about which of those things it needs. That usually guides me to a pretty useful answer. Another closely related thing to change is the number of functions. Again, it's common for each drum layer to match up with one of our 3 drum functions, but it's not necessary. Like in Ballroom Blitz, the verse drums have them spread out like normal, but under the riff, the high drums drop out and the constant function moves down to join the engine on the snare. That's 3 functions from 2 layers. For the opposite, I think the clearest example is probably the blast beat. This is playing all 3 layers, but all 3 layers are playing the constant, setting it apart from other sections with more distinct functions. And again, while I don't want to overspecify, a good rule of thumb is that the beat provides stability, the engine provides excitement, and the constant provides noise. In my experience, most single function sections are either the beat or the constant, but Major Tom just has an engine. So do whatever, there are no rules. And that also ties into our next main category, the rhythm. Okay, maybe that's obvious, but still, gotta talk about it. And here, I'd like to draw a distinction between what Dr. Geary calls the surface rhythm and what I'm gonna call the fundamental rhythm. The surface rhythm is just like the rhythm. It's all the hits the drummer actually plays. But underneath that is the fundamental rhythm. Most genres have certain expectations for what a drum part is supposed to contain. When we talk about the standard rock beat, for instance, we're assuming a kick on 1 and 3, snare on 2 and 4, and 8th note hi-hats. Again, back in black. And these assumptions are strong enough that we can even hear them when they're hidden by a more complicated surface. Like in Somewhere I Belong, I can easily pick out a halftime backbeat, even if the actual snare part is doing a lot more stuff. This gives us a couple different ways to change the rhythm. First, we can change only the surface rhythm. This is probably the simplest change to make, and it's a great go-to technique if you don't want the changing section to sound too drastic. Like in Livin' on a Prayer, the kick starts out as a really standard rock beat, and the chorus adds an extra hit to set up beat 3. Subtle and easy to miss because it still has the same basic character, but it keeps the song building in the right direction. But we can also change the fundamental rhythm. This obviously changes the surface, but it also has a deeper impact on the overall metric feel. And here, I think it's worth looking at what some of these fundamental rhythms even are. Again, these are very culturally defined, so I'm not going to be able to cover every possible rhythm, but in the realm of Western popular music, there's a couple main ones that seem to dominate. For the beat and the constant, these tend to be what I'll call simple rhythms. That is, rhythms that are only a single note length repeated over and over. That could be a whole note, like a symbol marking the start of each bar, a half note, like the standard rock beat kick, a quarter note, like in disco's famous 4 on the floor pattern, or 8ths, 16ths, and so on. Simple rhythms provide a strong, stable foundation that's easy to groove to, and they show up all the time in all sorts of styles. Besides the simple rhythms, though, the most common fundamental rhythm is almost certainly the tresillo. This is a slightly lopsided pattern that divides the 8 eighth notes of a bar into 3 roughly even attacks. And while it's often heard on its own, the tresillo is actually the first half of a 2-bar pattern called the clave, or in rock, the Bo Diddley beat. Both of those are options as well. And you can also add something to the simple rhythms. Taking 8th note hi-hats, for instance, and adding an extra 16th at the end of each beat gives you the gallop rhythm. This is far from an exhaustive list, and we didn't even look at the rhythms you can do in meters other than 4/4, but I think you get the point. To make engines, on the other hand, we need to get a bit more creative. There's 3 basic techniques here: displacement, removal, and misalignment. Displacement means taking a simple rhythm and bumping it over to start somewhere other than the downbeat, and we can see it in literally any song with a backbeat. Hitting on 2 and 4 is still a half-note pulse, it's just a quarter note late. This creates excitement through syncopation, or more specifically through the phenomenon of rhythmic telescoping. If I take a kick drum playing whole notes, double the speed, then double it again, I still have a rhythm with basically the same character. There's this sort of anchor point on the downbeat that it always comes back to, so no matter how fast the pulse, it always hits the same way. But if I instead take a backbeat snare and double that speed just once, it's not even on the backbeat anymore. Displaced rhythms are ungrounded without a clear, unmoving focal point, which makes them much more sensitive to the specific rhythmic space they occupy. This rhythmic telescoping effect can also be used to change time feels. In You're Gonna Go Far, Kid, the verse snare is extremely fast, implying a tempo north of 250 beats per minute, but the pre-chorus switches the snare to halftime to momentarily settle. Removal, on the other hand, does exactly what it says on the tin. You just take a standard rhythm and remove 1 or more notes, typically including the downbeat. You can actually do all the displacement stuff this way if you want, but it's more useful with less consistent rhythms like the tresillo. In clocks, we heard the snare as a grounded beat, but if we remove the first attack, we get the dembo snare, which is clearly an engine. And misalignment is the term I'm using for like cross rhythms, polyrhythms, and the like, where you have a simple repeating rhythm that just happens to contradict the main pattern. Usually this is some sort of dotted rhythm, like a dotted quarter, eighth, or 16th, giving you this phasing effect where the 3-beat cross rhythm drifts in and out of sync with the 4-beat pulse. Honestly, I mostly see this in non-drum instruments, but there's nothing stopping you from putting it on like a snare if you wanted. And the last thing we can change is the instrumentation itself. The most common versions of this are probably moving from the hi-hat to a ride cymbal, or replacing a cross stick with a full snare hit. This pretty quickly leads us back to that problem from the beginning. There are just so many choices, especially if you're using a sampler. You could have a library with hundreds of options. How do you decide which one is right? Well, beyond just like vibe, the 3 things I'd look for are timbre, decay, and connotation. You can think of the first 2 as how much acoustic space the drum takes up. Timbre is the vertical component, telling you how noisy the sound is, and decay is the horizontal component, telling you how long it lasts for. This is the main reason behind both of our examples. The hi-hat and the cross stick are short, sharp sounds that cut through, make their point, and then go away. The snare and the ride, on the other hand, are longer, noisier, and they bleed out into the rest of the soundscape, lingering in the gaps between hits and making their respective sections feel a lot more crowded. Connotation, on the other hand, is less about the sound itself and more about what the sound represents. Drums, like all instruments, are cultural objects and they belong to certain cultural contexts. That could be the shotgun snare in 80s arena rock, the washboard in traditional American folk and jazz, or body percussion in pretty much any genre that invites audience participation. Using a sound evokes that sound's context, so the intended stylistic atmosphere of your piece will naturally shape your drum choices as well. Which brings me to an important question. When should you change drum patterns, and how often? So far, I've mostly been focused on sections, which feels like the most obvious answer. Writing different drum parts for the verse, pre-chorus, chorus, and bridge gives you a good sense of build across the song. And yeah, that works, but sometimes you might want more. You might want a particular section, often a pre-chorus, to have its own internal build with multiple different drum parts. Just to sleep, but now we're stressed out. Or you might want a larger build over the course of the entire song, in which case you could use different patterns for the first verse
Good for you, I guess you moved on really easily.
and the second one.
And you bought a new car and your career's really taking off.
Of course, none of this is to say that you need to sit down and write out every drum hit. If you're working with a drummer, you can always choose to just let them do their job. But as a vocalist, I know the pain of working with people who don't understand the basic mechanics of my instrument, so I think it's worth learning what the drums can actually do so you can make more specific requests than just like play a better thing. And again, if you're writing songs these days, there's a good chance you're not actually working with a drummer, you're working with a drum machine, and in that case, you have a lot more decisions to make. Honestly, that's really who this video is for. If you're sequencing a beat, it's so easy to just set it once and leave it for the whole song, and that's fine, as long as you're doing it on purpose. But arranging is all about knowing your toolbox and using your tools, so it's always worth asking if you're sticking with one pattern because it's what the song needs, or if you just couldn't be bothered to write a second one. When I'm making these videos, I always wind up with a bunch of extra stuff that doesn't really fit into the script, either because it's too much of a tangent, it breaks the narrative flow, or it's just too niche to appeal to the sort of broad audiences that YouTube relies on. But I still think that stuff is worth sharing, and if you've made it this far, I suspect you probably do too. So a while back, I started recording an extra section at the end of each video where I talk a bit more off the cuff about the topic, and dive a bit deeper into the research I did and the various extra bits of information that came up. But if you know my work, it probably won't surprise you to learn that those sections quickly ballooned in length to the point where I was adding an extra 5 to 10 minutes of content to each video. Which sounds great, but YouTube doesn't like it when you have a really long section that most people don't watch, and it was starting to hurt my channel. I didn't want to stop though, so instead I decided to move those closing thoughts sections over to Nebula, and as soon as I did, they started getting longer again. So at this point, there's a lot of extra stuff in the Nebula versions of these videos. It's kind of a problem. Anyway, if you've got a Nebula account, you can hop on over there to watch all that, and if you don't, you can use the link in the description to get 40% off an annual plan to check it out. Beyond listening to me ramble a bunch, Nebula also produces a lot of other really cool stuff, like Jesse Gender's sci-fi short film Identities, and some great music classes by folks like Amy Nolte and Adam Neely that can't be found anywhere else. I've been working with Nebula since the beginning, and it's been really great to have a place to put my work where I don't have to worry if an algorithm is gonna like all the choices I made. Again, 40% off with a link in the description. And hey, thanks for watching. Thanks to our Patreon patrons for making these videos possible. And extra special thanks to our featured patrons, Susan Jones, Jill Sungard, Howard Levine, Warren Hewitt, Damian Fuller-Sutherland, Neil Moore, Jeff, and Michael Mole. Check out the Nebula cut for a fuller outro, and as always, keep on rockin'.